And we shall begin. So I will begin by welcoming everybody to this Thesis Theatre. I'm delighted that you've come to join us. Bear with me, I'm just sorting out all my many windows, which is why I look like I'm not even looking at you at the moment. There we go. But yes, welcome one, welcome all to this Thesis Theatre with Father Andrew Damick. We'll get started in a moment, but just a couple of things before we get started. Please do feel free to chat amongst yourselves in the chat. In fact, do that as much as you like. When it comes to asking questions, I will be asking you please to put your questions in the Q&A box. All right, that would be preferable, particularly as there are quite a few of you. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, that way questions don't get lost in the chat box. So feel free to put them into the Q&A box at any point, and I will be looking in there regularly to see what questions I can throw Father Andrew's way. We've got some lovely messages coming into the chat already for you, Father Andrew.
Hey, everybody.
Okay, so we will start by welcoming Father Andrew Damick. The Very Reverend Andrew Stephen Damick is an archpriest of the Antiochian Orthodox Church, Chief Content Officer of Ancient Faith Ministries, author of 5 books with a 6th forthcoming in 2025 because the man needs no sleep, and host or co-host of 9 podcasts. His work has been translated into Romanian, Spanish, Russian, Lithuanian, Mandarin Chinese, and Vietnamese. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in English Language and Literature with minors in Religion, Ancient Greek, and Classical Studies from North Carolina State University, and a Master of Divinity degree from St. Tikhon's Orthodox Theological Seminary with honours in the field of church history. He served in parish ministry for 13 years and has worked in Orthodox Christian media since 2020. He's married with 4 children and resides in Emmaus, Pennsylvania, but most importantly, he believes in both dragons and giants. Now, his title of his thesis that he's going to be talking about today is Tolkien's Gods, Divine Council Theology in J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth Legendarium. Right, Father Andrew, welcome.
Thank you. All right. Let me share my slides here.
Yes, because what I would like you to do is to start off by telling us all about your thesis.
Yes,
so you have a presentation for us.
Yep. So I'm going to give an overview of the thesis, and I will tell everybody that if you really want all of the receipts, so to speak, you will have to read it. I'm going to be, as I said, giving just an overview. And so all of the lovely, wonderful, amazing, colorful details are in the paper itself. But you should get the basic argument from what we're going to be talking about today. So as Dr. Brown said, thank you very much. This thesis is titled Tolkien's Gods. And I'm attempting to address a piece of this question that you often see, which is the question is Middle-earth Christian or pagan? There are a lot of scholars that have written about this, and I found every scrap of anything about this that I could from scholarly writing. And one of the things that struck me is that most of it doesn't actually go that deep, in my opinion. Some of it does, but most of it doesn't. But you can find all kinds of scholarly views about this question, and we're going to be going over some of those today. But also, this is actually a question that is popularly interesting to people. I've found various memes that talk about, this question of whether Tolkien's Legendarium is Christian or pagan. And some people even seem to think, like this meme here on the right, that Tolkien was secretly pagan. And if that really is the case, he is possibly the worst pagan that I have ever heard of, because especially towards the end of his life, this man went to Mass every single day. He seems to have been Roman Catholic as far as anyone could tell. But the question is often framed this way: is Middle-earth Christian or pagan? I think that that's way too broad because it's a big, complex set of texts. And so I want to narrow it. And the question I'm attempting to answer is, are the gods of Middle-earth more like pagan gods or more like Christian gods? And I know that you might be kind of wondering what that phrase Christian gods means. We'll get to that. And why would I put it this way? Well, while there's a lot of aspects to this question of paganism and Christianity in the legendarium, the one that I think is probably the most important, the central one, is what are the Valar exactly? Are they gods in the pagan sense? Are they basically just Christian angels? Not that this is the only part of that question, but I think it is probably the foremost part of that question, and certainly is brought up by a lot of scholars. And it is the thing that is brought up over and over again in popular discussions about this. And also why I want to put it this way is because almost none of the discussion that I found about this actually takes into account the actual religious traditions that are being mentioned. You know, what exactly is Christianity? What exactly is paganism, or really, I should say even paganisms, because it's really many, many religious traditions throughout history that are described with that term. So that's why I'm putting the question this way. And in examining the question, this is the methodology that I use. Number one, I said, look, we need to define Christianity a lot more broadly than most analysis of this does. And the reason is that almost all of it, not all of it, but almost all of it seems to assume essentially a kind of Protestant model. And I know that's another broad term. But in this, I essentially mean what in the Protestant Reformation is described by the phrase sola scriptura. In other words, looking only at the Bible, that the Bible represents Christian tradition kind of in toto. And while if someone is a Protestant, then that commitment is very understandable. Tolkien himself was not a Protestant, and he certainly did not believe in sola scriptura. And Christianity is a 2,000-year-old tradition with a lot going on for the 1,500 years before the Reformation. So that's why we're defining Christianity a lot more broadly in this analysis. And the second part of my methodology is to look at representative primary texts from these religious traditions. So I'm looking at pagan mythology, but I'm also looking at the Bible, but I'm looking at other texts beyond the Bible as well, right? And so then within that methodology, I'm going to look at divine councils amongst both the pagan traditions and in Christianity and compare that to the Valar. So that's the roadmap. The central argument that I'm making is that if you use divine council theology, which I'll define what that means, and you compare the divine councils of both pagan and Christian traditions by looking at these texts, then the Ainur, which is the broader category that includes the Valar, but is basically interchangeable for the purpose of this argument, that the Ainur of Tolkien's legendarium looks more like the divine council of Christian tradition. I'm not going to say it looks exactly like that, and you're going to see why I say that. So I'm just going to go over what are some of the most common, not all, but the most common of interpretations of the legendarium, the Valar and the legendarium, that can be described essentially as pagan. So a number just straight out say, look, you've got a bunch of gods, that's polytheism, divine plurality equals polytheism, Christianity is monotheist, so that means the Ainur are pagan, case closed. And that's frankly where most of the social media conversation about it happens. But you might be surprised, actually a lot of the scholarly analysis essentially makes that argument. Some will go a little bit deeper and they'll say, well, Tolkien is taking polytheism, but he's just sort of repackaging it as monotheism. But it's just a facade. You know, he wants to look Christian, so but he super loves the gods, so he's using pagan divine council theology. One of the things that's often said is the Valar and the Maiar are closely related to natural elements, you know, earth, fire, air, water, or they govern nature. And as we all know, that's pagan, right? Another argument that's made is that the Valar participate in the act of creation, and you know, angels don't do that, so that must be pagan. A more sophisticated argument about them, this is one that's particularly made by Verlyn Flieger in one of her works. She says that the Ainur are limited god figures, but they're not quite fully pagan gods, but they're not really angels either. Not really angels either. So she kind of leans pagan in terms of her interpretation. And then there's a kind of a, I don't know, I don't want to use the word unique because I'm sure other people maybe have said this, but a curious and idiosyncratic interpretation made by a scholar named Claudio Testi. And he says, look, what Tolkien does is not exactly Christianity, and it's not exactly historical paganism, but rather it's something he calls Tolkienian paganism. In other words, that Tolkien invents his own pagan religion effectively. And that's what he's doing in those texts. So Christian interpretations, these vary a lot. Many just simply say, well, the Valar are angels, and Tolkien himself uses the word angels, not in the legendarium texts proper, but certainly in his letters and some other places. And so they just say, end of story. The Valar are just angels. Others will say, look, Middle-earth is monotheist. Tolkien says it's monotheist, so that any kind of paganism there is just nominal. It just looks like paganism, but it's not really. Others, particularly Joseph Pearce, who uses Tolkien's works for apologetical purposes for Roman Catholicism, he explicitly says that Middle-earth's God is the Christian God. And so even if the Valar are called gods, they're not gods, because Christianity doesn't have gods. It just has the one God. So he makes the argument on that basis. Other Christians will say that the Valar, they're not really creators. They're just kind of ancillary in the act of creation. They're sort of intermediaries. And that's not really the way paganism works. So it's not pagan, it's Christian. Surprisingly rare, in my opinion, is that only a couple of scholars who are interpreting the legendarium as Christian point out that no one worships the Valar. Ralph Wood says this in his book, which I think is the Gospel according to Tolkien. Another, sort of the flip side of that idea that Tolkien presents polytheism packaged as monotheism, Sam McBride says that the Valar represent what he calls a monotheistic polytheism. So he just sort of throws both words together and says, well, the emphasis is on the word monotheistic here. Stratford Caldecott, who, interesting fact, is buried in the same cemetery as Tolkien in Oxford. He says that the legendarium effectively corrects paganism. It takes what's good about paganism and then offers corrections to make adjustments. So this is a kind of an overview. It's not everything we could say about these things, but this is an overview of what scholars generally are saying about the Valar. A lot of this is predicated upon what I think is a fundamental category error, which is defining monotheism as meaning one God exists, and that's Christianity. Polytheism as meaning many gods exist, and that's paganism, right? And so you can just compare the two against each other. And, atheism, no God exists, right? So this dilemma is what is used in almost all analyses of the Valar. And as I said, it is a category error. And I'm going to show you briefly why that is the case. So we all know paganism does divine plurality. It's got a lot of gods. But even if you limit yourself to just the Bible in Christian tradition, the Bible is weirdly plural in terms of its reference to gods. So, for instance, in the Septuagint version, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which was made about 3 centuries BC, the phrase "king of the gods" is used by Moses at one point where he addresses God. He calls him the king of the gods, which is a weird thing to say if there aren't any other gods. The phrase referring to God as being among the gods, usually saying he's different, right? He's different from all of them, that he's among the gods. That's in the Hebrew Bible. God of gods, also in the Hebrew Bible. That God is above all gods, also in the Hebrew Bible. And then 54 times you get the phrase "most high" or "most high God." That is really hard to square away with the idea that the Bible equals monotheism equals only one God exists. And this, I think, is a glaring flaw in a lot of the analysis that is out there. Even if set aside, ignorance about the rest of Christian tradition, at least there should be a close look at the Bible, at least. So even if you just look at the Bible, you see divine plurality there. And then also, and this is where we get this phrase divine counsel, Psalm 82:1, this is the image of the Christian divine council. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. And whether you read that in the original Hebrew or the Greek translations, several centuries BC, that is what it says. That is what it says, that God is in a divine council and he's standing in the midst of gods. So this is kind of our basic model for understanding divine council theology. Divine councils show up in paganism. Norse, the Norse gods, Odin leads them. They gather together at Yggdrasil, the great world tree, and they hold court. They discuss things. You can see this in the actual texts that represent Norse mythology. Of course, anyone who knows anything about Greek polytheism knows that the gods are all up there on Olympus and they're having conversations with Zeus. This is all over Greek pagan literature. Happens again and again, for instance, just in the Iliad, right? One of the great Homeric epics. And then Canaanite paganism, the gods gather under the great god El on Mount Zaphon to hold court. Now, why did I bring up Canaanite paganism? It might be obvious, Norse and Greek, because these are traditions that Tolkien is working with. But Canaanite paganism is the paganism that most of the Old Testament is written within that context. Canaanite pagans are the people that surround Israel and occasionally kind of somewhat take it over. That's a story for another time. But in any event, God's gathering together in council, this is very, very common. So now I'm going to show you a series of tables, and I will emphasize again that this is the very stripped down version of the argument and doesn't have all of the examples that are in the actual paper. So looking at the divine council, the general model, and the way, the way that I've coded these tables is where there is an element that paganism, Christianity, and Middle Earth all have in common. It's color-coded in blue. When it's something that's particular to paganism and possibly shared with Middle Earth, it's coded in yellow. And where it's, particular to Christianity and possibly shared with Middle Earth, it's coded in brown. And then you'll see there's some stuff in orange, and that's where Middle Earth is different from everything else, right? So in all these traditions, many gods exist. That is simply the case. That is what the evidence shows. In all of these traditions, there's one God who rules above all the rest of the gods. That's in all of these traditions. In paganism, whoever is this ruler, this most high God, is stronger than the other gods, but basically the same nature as them. The same nature. But in Christianity, and also in Tolkien's world, the most high God is a completely different kind of being than the other gods. So God is different. I mean, it says this over and over in the Bible, that God is very different from the other gods. And of course, we can see that Eru Ilúvatar in the Silmarillion is very, very different from the Valar. Right. So this is just the basic model of divine councils in these traditions. So one thing that a lot of the analyses, the scholarly analyses of this question completely leave out is actual religious practice. Actual religious practice, which that's what religion is about in many ways. In fact, some religions don't even have what we might think of as doctrine or beliefs, or it's just a bare outline. In fact, most of paganism is that way, right? So what you have is practices. So let's look at the practices. So as we know, in paganism, you can pray to lots of gods. In Christianity, again, if you're not Protestant, you can pray to many gods. Now, that might sound weird, but if you look closely at the Bible, you can see that the word God is used to refer to angels in many cases, right? Sort of lowercase g gods. Now, there is no upper and lowercase in ancient Hebrew. There's no upper and lowercase in ancient Greek either. But this is how English kind of parses this out. But also, in later Christian tradition, saints are called gods. Again, it's always that lowercase g sense, not the same as God, but gods. And certainly non-Protestant Christians, Roman Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and some others will pray to these beings, to angels and saints. So the idea that you pray to many gods, no problem for most Christians throughout history. Where it's different is that paganism worships many gods. In Tolkien's world, there is not a lot of worship going on. It is there. It absolutely is there. There are offerings being made sometimes to Ilúvatar up on top of the big mountain there in Numenor. It's strongly suggested that Aragorn is probably going to start some of that kind of thing back up again. I think Tolkien says that in one of his letters. But only Ilúvatar is supposed to be worshipped in Tolkien's world. There is, of course, some worship that happens of Morgoth, but that is very, very condemned within the text, right? And this is exactly like in Christianity. It's exactly like in Christianity. There's one God you're supposed to worship, Yahweh. In Christianity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the God of Israel. And there are other gods that are worshipped, even by Israel, but it's always condemned as idolatry. It's not supposed to be done. Right? So only one is supposed to be worshipped. So let's look at creation and also the origins of the gods. I've kind of mixed this together because in paganism, these things happen at the same time. So generally in paganism, creation is made out of what is called technically chaos kampf, which means this sort of struggle in the midst of chaos to bring order out of chaos. It's a struggle. There's a war. There's maybe dismemberment of some kind of big divine being. And there are a lot of gods that participate in creation typically. And then the gods themselves are also created or birthed typically out of other gods, most of them. And there are various gods that are assigned to different elements. This is all very familiar, even if you just know, for instance, Greek mythology. In Christianity, over on the right, creation is not from chaos kampf. Creation is simply spoken into being out of nothing. So this is ex nihilo is the technical Latin term for this, creation out of nothing. God does the creating. God speaks everything into being in Christianity. And then humans participate in sub-creation. If angels sub-create in any way, that's completely off camera. That's, as far as I know, is not being represented, that angels are making things. But humans are. Humans are rearranging stuff to make new things out of what has already been made. In Christianity, God is uncreated. He has no beginning. He's there. There was no time when he didn't exist. And then the gods, that is the angels, are created by God. And then, and this is a part that might be surprising to some people, the angels, these lesser gods, are assigned to various natural elements. This is another one of the things that a lot of the people who lean in the pagan interpretation and say, well, you know, the Valar are assigned to natural elements and that's pagan. You can only say that if you don't know the full Christian tradition, right? So while this is not explicit in the Bible, there are some hints at it where angels are associated with natural elements. And often there's, like in Psalms, David will speak to the angels and also speak to the winds and the mountains and the seas, kind of in the same breath. This is actually made very explicit in some other texts that sort of surround the Bible. So a number of things which are called Second Temple Jewish texts, which are basically the same period as the New Testament and for a couple of centuries before. You've got a particular text called the Book of Jubilees, which is essentially Genesis kind of from another angle. And in Jubilees, as the various natural elements of the world are created, God specifically assigns different angels to those natural elements. My favorite is that there are 4 angels that govern each of the 4 seasons, right? And as I sometimes say to people, if I ever get to meet the angel of autumn, the first thing I'm going to say to him is, I'm a big fan of your work. You're the best one. Don't tell the other guys. But yeah, this idea that angels or gods are assigned over the natural elements is absolutely part of Christian tradition. And so then when we look at Tolkien's world, you know, there's a central column in Arda, creation is ex nihilo, just like in Christianity. Where it's a bit different is that the Most High God does the creating, but the Valar subcreate. So that's different from both paganism and from Christianity, is the relationship of these lesser gods to the creation. It's not really creation, though, that the Valar do. The Valar do not make something out of nothing. They take something and make it into something new, which is what sub-creation is, as defined by Tolkien. In Tolkien's world, Eru Ilúvatar is uncreated. He has no beginning. He simply is there. And then the gods, the Ainur, are created by him. That's just like Christianity. And of course, also, as we know, the gods, the Valar, are assigned to various elements. So let's look at another category. And each one of these tables, by the way, represents a section of my thesis. One of the stories that again, I don't see this really analyzed very much in most of the relevant literature, is a key narrative in divine council theology, and that is what is called the succession myth. The idea that the Most High God can get kicked off his throne and another high God comes and takes his or her place. Okay, so that's the basic idea: is this usurpation, a replacing, a succeeding. You know, and it's always done violently. There's never a natural succession that goes on. You know, so in all 3 of these traditions or texts, this gets attempted, right? In paganism, as it's getting attempted, there's a big battle then, typically between the pretender and the original. And then it succeeds. In paganism, it always succeeds. So for instance, Zeus succeeds his father Kronos. Again, it's through violence, right? And then the usurper becomes the Most High God. So it happens. In Christianity, of course, it is attempted, and this is depicted 3 times in the Old Testament, that Lucifer, or the Satan or the devil, or whichever language you want to use for him, he attempts to, as you say, set his throne above the stars of the heavens, that he's going to make himself like the Most High or above the Most High. So it's get attempted, but there is no battle. There's no point where you see God and Lucifer kind of locked in hand-to-hand combat. Lucifer is simply thrown out. So it fails. He's just defeated and cast out because God is so much more powerful that it's not even a struggle. It's not. So in Tolkien's world, again, it's attempted. You get Melkor attempting this in the Ainulindale. And there is a battle, but it's not exactly for the throne of Ilúvatar. It's this kind of musical battle of the bands, like an epic rap battle of, but there's no question who's in charge the whole time. Ilúvatar is not in any danger of getting replaced, okay? But I put it orange in this case because it is significantly different from Christianity in that there is a struggle of sorts that goes on. The succession fails. Melkor does not win the day, and of course he's ultimately defeated and cast out. And then the final analysis, and this is one I saw zero reference to in any of the scholarship that I read, is that in most divine councils, whether pagan or Christian, there is a figure called the vice regent. So this vice regent is sort of the second in command, the one who rules directly over the divine council, while the Most High God is kind of on a throne in the background in many cases, right? So paganism has vice regents. Christianity, of course, as we know, has a vice regent who is, the Son of God, the Word of God, also called the Angel of the Lord or the Angel of Yahweh. And the New Testament identifies him as Jesus. Jesus is this vice regent. He's the Son of God. In paganism, this vice regent is the same nature as the Most High God, and often described as being his son. In fact, usually, right? It's a father and son pair. That's the same as in Christianity. But in Arda, it's different. So who's the vice regent in Arda? It's Manwë, but he's not the same as Ilúvatar. He does not have the same nature as Ilúvatar. He's simply one of the Ainur, a much lesser being, much lesser being, right? So that's unique to Arda in comparison. And then in paganism, the vice regent is a kind of a lesser but separate divinity. It's not the same person, so sometimes you can have disagreements between the Most High and the vice regent. In Christianity, it is an equal and unseparate divine figure. The Father and the Son are traditionally understood to be of one essence, of one nature. So they're different persons, but one nature. So they're unseparate divinity. Whereas in Arda, what you get is essentially something that's more like in paganism, where it's a lesser and also separate divinity. In paganism, the vice regent is worshipped. Why wouldn't you? It's a god. You should worship it. In Christianity, the vice regent is worshipped. Of course you should, because he is also somehow the Most High God, as well as being the son of the Most High God. So he should be worshipped. But in Arda, the vice regent is not worshipped. No one worships Manwë. They respect him. They venerate him, but no one's putting sacrifices in front of him. He's not worshipped. So this is the category in which Tolkien's handling of an element of divine council theology is pretty much different from everything else. So this is an overview chart, kind of looking at all these things together, right? And as you can see, again, this does not have all the detail. But as you can see that where Arda is different from paganism, it's usually just like in Christianity. Sometimes it's a little different. Like in cosmogony and theogony, you can see that it is different, but it's actually leans towards Christianity because there's this ex nihilo creation and the gods themselves are created. And it's really just a difference between who does the subcreation. It's in the vice regent where you get something that's really quite different. But the preponderance of evidence definitely falls to Christianity based on all of this. And again, like I said, if you want the receipts, you want all the details, you're going to have to read the actual thesis. So some conclusions. First, I wanted to highlight this comment from Stratford Caldecott, and this is in the appendix to his book, The Power of the Ring, where he discusses this question of people who give pagan interpretations to the legendarium. He himself is a Christian, and he said this. He said, "What those who make pagan interpretations of Lord of the Rings find evoked and celebrated in the book is worth celebrating. The enchantment of a natural world full of living presences, of stars associated with benign femininity, beauty and kindness allied with heroism, a freshness of vision giving rise to ineffable gratitude, a sense of wickedness integrated in some greater harmony. None of this is incompatible with Christianity. though historically many Christians have denied these various things. In that sense, Tolkien is pointing us toward a richer and more beautiful conception of Christianity. And so this is Caldecott kind of pointing in the direction of what I've been saying, which is, look, if you're going to ask the question, is this Christian or is it not Christian, at least in these specific areas, you need to look at the broader tradition of Christianity. And he mentions this, that there's some Christians who denied some of this stuff. But historical Christianity, that is to say, the history prior to the Reformation, the 16th century, has no problem with these things. And so here's some of the conclusions that I drew. Number one, the Ainur do not map neatly onto either pagan divinities or Christian gods. A lot of people who pushed really hard in one of those directions love to say, no, they're just this, they're just that. And I just do not think that that is the case. But more often than not, where they are more like one or the other, they're more like Christian gods. And one of the things I think that creates a blind spot for a lot of people is that there are certain key aspects that are conventionally identified as pagan that are actually Christian too. Number one, there's a lot of gods. Fine, Christianity does that. That these gods are assigned to areas of nature. Again, Christianity has always done that. And as we saw, there's some other stuff like this too. So in some ways, the Ainur are unique, but in several of these cases, they lean more toward the Christian model. So why is this interesting? I'll tell you why it's interesting to me, and maybe why it could be interesting to you. Number one, it makes a contribution to this question: is Middle-earth pagan or Christian? Again, I'm not saying it exhausts that question, but I'm handling what I think is the central part of it. Now, some might want to use this study for religious apologetical purposes. That is not what I want out of it at all, but some people might be interested in that. This study also shows that if we're going to make reference to religious traditions when we're interpreting literature, especially if you're a scholar, you should explore those traditions much more deeply. Do not settle for a reduced version. And the problem is, of course, sometimes people don't know what they don't know. And a lot of times academic disciplines don't really talk to each other. So I think that it's helpful if they do. So in my opinion, most of the analyses of divine plurality in this legendarium are kind of on the shallow or incomplete side, whether it's people interpreting them as pagan or as Christian. And so most important to me is that if you use this model, this divine council model, for interpreting the Ainur, that it opens up new avenues for understanding and appreciating the Middle-earth legendarium. So for me, it's not about providing an answer to a question. It's about opening a big door that no one seems to be trying yet. And so I'm hoping that I've unlocked that door and maybe opened it a little bit of a crack for people to have a look and see what they might find inside. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening to my presentation on my thesis. And thank you, Dr. Brown, for advising me on this thesis and giving me really good direction. And thanks to everybody that helped me in researching it. This has been a lot of fun to do.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely wonderful. And judging by all the comments coming through in the chat, everybody watching you thought exactly the same thing. Absolutely tremendous work. And I just want to say, as Father Andrew's thesis director, it has been beyond a pleasure to work with Father Andrew, because he is an extraordinary scholar and somebody who has taught me an enormous amount, and for which I am very grateful also. There are a lot of questions in the Q&A, Father Andrew, which doesn't surprise me. So maybe we should start by picking out one or two of those before we go on to some of the other questions. Just a reminder, folks, if you have any questions for Father Andrew, because there are so many of you, can you just put your questions into the Q&A box, please? That will make life a lot easier for all of us. So a really simple question to start off with, and I'm joking here. Colin would like to know what angels in Orthodoxy would be related closest to the Valar.
So it's an interesting question. The one that's probably the most obvious is a lot of people say that Manwe is like the Archangel Michael. There's a number of ways in which he seems to parallel Saint Michael. And one of the problems, of course, is that most angels in Christianity we have no names for them. Mm-hmm. And we just get what they do. We see them doing things. And that's because Generally, they're presented in what might be thought of as a phenomenological way. That is, this is how humanity is experiencing them. It's not a kind of taxonomy of who and what they are. It's just, oh, they showed up and did this, right? So we have various, the seven archangels, they do have names. One of the fun things about researching that is you'll discover that there's about 10, 12, 15 names for the seven archangels. But it's always Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael on the top, and then everything else is varied. So yeah, it would be hard to map them one to one. That's for sure. The one that often gets done is Michael de Monway, and I think that makes the most sense.
Okay, thank you for that. And one more question for now from the Q&A. I will return to the Q&A. Marcus would like to ask, didn't Tolkien draw heavily on the Norse mythology for his world building, but also blended Christian elements to make it syncretic, only for the story, of course?
So, number one, syncretism is a particular religious category, right? It's where you mix the worship of various things together. So I would say that what Tolkien did is what he described in On Fairy Stories, that it's, this cauldron of story, and there's lots of ingredients that are kind of thrown into this big soup, and it's boiling together, and he wants to serve you up some good soup. And actually, he says at one point, he's not a big fan if you try to pick apart the ingredients. Now, I know that this thesis is all about picking apart some of the ingredients, and Tolkien studies is basically about picking apart the ingredients in many ways. But yes, he's putting all of these things together. And honestly, in doing that, he is engaging in a very traditional, classic Christian thing. There is a lot over the history of Christianity which takes pagan literature and says, how do you understand this in a Christian way? How do you bring it together? There are Byzantine era commentaries on Homer, for instance, and this is centuries after the last Greek pagan is dead. Byzantine Christians are all very interested in reading Homer because for them, Homer is the basis of education. So, Tolkien is simply doing what people of his kind have always done.
Mm-hmm. So just to add on to all of these things, you pointed out when you were talking to us a few moments ago that so many critical and scholarly analyses of Tolkien's gods fall short. But why do you think that is? Why do they fall short?
I think the biggest problem is that academic disciplines don't talk to each other. And it's funny, like even if you do, like, New Testament scholars and Old Testament scholars kind of live each in their own bubbles, which is, I mean, from a Christian point of view, sounds crazy, but it is absolutely the case. And so I think that in many cases, a lot of these scholars just don't know what they don't know. They don't know that there is a whole field that's dedicated to examining, divine pluralism in Christianity versus, paganism, right? And like one of the scholars that I read who has helped this, I know probably some people are here because they're fans of his, is the late Michael Heiser, who is an evangelical Protestant scholar who talked about divine plurality in Christianity in the Bible. And so for a lot of people, this is stuff that's kind of exciting and new. And I think that particularly as more academic work gets done with the internet as a tool, perhaps, there'll be more of this kind of thing. And I mean, it seems like every day I see a new interpretation of Tolkien based on some other lens. So that's great, I think. That doesn't mean I agree with all of them, but to me, it's really a fascinating thing to see this. And so the more that these things bump together, I think the more fruitful the readings of Tolkien's work and of other kind of works like it are going to be.
Okay, well, just working off that answer to that question, do you have any suggestions for other interdisciplinary interpretations of Tolkien?
Yeah, well, I think that, I mean, number one, obviously biblical studies, I think, because, Tolkien himself being a Christian, there's a lot of, I mean, there is a whole industry of Christian interpretations of Tolkien,
Yeah.
but a lot of it is kind of devotional or apologetic, and that's fine. That's fine. But some of us want to kind of go deeper in another way. So, like for instance, I saw there's a book out that's an analysis of Tolkien's works from the point of view of Thomas Aquinas from scholasticism. That's not my field, but that's very interesting. I think that I know someone who's looked at some prehistorical anthropology and actually mapped a lot of stuff from Neanderthals, Java man, I don't know, these prehistoric humans, and actually mapped them onto the various kinds of humanoid races that are in Tolkien's works, and it weirdly works. It was kind of, it was a lecture I listened to. I was like freaking out at how sort of appropriate, and I was very happy to learn that the Neanderthals were essentially elves, because as a Lithuanian, ethnic Lithuanian, I have a lot of Neanderthal blood. So there we go. So yeah, I mean, the sky's the limit, I think. Particularly stuff that's related to what Tolkien is working on. He himself was interested in a lot of fields. We know this because there's now, you can buy a book that is literally everything that was in his library, which that's cool.
That is cool. So tell me, why is it that you reject the apologetic approach to Tolkien studies?
I mean, apologetics, the whole point of apologetics is to either try to convert people to your religious point of view or to explain your religious point of view using whatever it is you've got at hand. And this is, of course, is a classic discipline of religious practice. So it's not that I reject apologetics, but I think that if you're going to do Christian apologetics in particular, that I just don't think Tolkien is the place to do it, because what you end up doing is you turn his work into a kind of agenda. And he really rejects this idea in the second preface to the Lord of the Rings, where he talks about allegory. And by allegory in that case, he doesn't mean this stands for this. He means this idea that the author is trying to dominate the reader with a particular interpretation. And I think that what apologetics, when inflicted upon Tolkien, always does is it cuts out a lot of the good bits.
Right.
It really does that. And so it's like, well, look, let's read the story as it is. And yeah, maybe someone comes away from that with a deeper appreciation of their faith or a deeper understanding of a faith, maybe that's not theirs, but they can see it fine. But to turn it into a kind of tract, that's not the genre. That's not his genre.
Okay, I'm going back to the Q&A for another question. So Jack would like to ask, is there any reason to believe Tolkien would have been familiar with the relevant Christian stroke Second Temple Jewish literature necessary for your argument? It seems to me like a lot of the specific aspects of Christian tradition are certainly in the Bible, but without supporting literature, you kind of have to read between the lines to pick up on it. In short, if Tolkien is really using this ancient Christian model of the divine council, where is he getting it? And he says, I know the Baal cycle wasn't discovered until pretty recently, along with the Dead Sea Scrolls and such.
Yeah. So I don't know that Tolkien would have been aware of the discovery of the Baal cycle, but it was in his lifetime, and he would have been, I think it was in the 20s or 30s. Now, it might not have been translated by that point. I don't know. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are in the 1940s. So he's still got a lot of life in him when these things are happening. And even though I haven't found evidence that he would have known about it, I strongly suspect he would have found it very interesting. That said, so that's an argument from circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a much stronger argument, which is that this model is embedded in medieval literature. And there has been a huge amount of study, for instance, done on Beowulf, which, as we know, this is ground zero for Tolkien's scholarly life and so forth. A lot of analysis has been done on Beowulf and the Book of Enoch, which is one of the key Second Temple Jewish texts. There's piles of papers out there about this. It seems that whoever wrote Beowulf probably was also familiar with a Second Temple Jewish text or early Christian pseudepigrapha text called the Apocalypse of Paul, in a version that circulated, as we know, in England in the medieval period. So while he may not be getting it directly by reading these texts directly himself, because maybe those disciplines weren't as advanced, what he is reading is people who read those things and use them in their texts. So he was essentially just continuing to be a sort of medieval Catholic. It's just there. So there has been a lot of work done in the relationship between Second Temple Jewish literature and medieval texts, but I tell you, it's just the beginning. So if there's any budding scholars out there who want to continue this stuff, go for it. There's a wealth of stuff to compare these days.
Well, I hope somebody out there is listening to that and going, challenge accepted. Okay, still plenty of questions in the Q&A for us. So Carl would like to ask, do you address or have thoughts on Job 38 verses 4 to 7, where the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy at or during the creation of the earth?
Oh, yes. I mean, I would have loved to have made this a whole chapter um, for the thesis. I mean, yes. I mean, you read this and you read the Ainur, and you know, it's very low hanging fruit. Um, and I mean, a fun fact: this phrase "sons of God" gets used several times in the Old Testament to refer to angels. It's pretty clear that it's angels. And at this point in the creation, who else is there? You know, there's no groups of humans that are singing together and shouting for joy. This is the angels that are doing this. Um, so I believe very firmly that Tolkien is inspired by this passage in Job when he does the Ainur. And I strongly kind of suspect that Lewis might well have had this in mind too when his creation story of Narnia includes singing, although it's you know, just mainly the lion doing it. But yeah, it's very evocative. And of course, then there's the echo where in the Gospels where you see the heavenly host singing again at the birth of Christ. So yeah. This is part of the stuff that I would have loved to have written on, and maybe I will.
Now, let's, in that case, slide into this question. You say you would have loved to have written on this. I'm sure there's other stuff you would have loved to have written on, but of course, like every other thesis student, you had a word limit. So if we had suddenly said, Father Andrew, please write us a 100,000 word master's thesis, what all would you have included that you had to leave out this time?
Yeah. Well, first I would be asking for a PhD in exchange for that, but
That would be
but so yes. So number one, there's a lot of star imagery, as I mean, this is everywhere in Tolkien's works. And stars are very connected to the Valar, especially to Elbereth, Varda herself. And stars are connected to angels in the Bible everywhere. This is over and over again. The stars, the sun, and the moon. I mean, in many ways, what's going on in Tolkien's creation narratives, because it's not just the Ainur, you also get the creation of the sun and moon happen later. Um, he's in some ways he's kind of remixing stuff from the Bible
Mhm.
or other elements of Christian tradition. Um, but one of the and so that's in there. But one of the fun things that I would love to do, like if I could do a kind of a part two of the thesis, it would be to ask the question: what happens when the children of Ilúvatar, so elves and humans, what happens when they spend a lot of time with the Valar or become like them in some way? Um, what constitutes their elevation? What is the relationship of the elves to the stars and the Valar? Is the Valar part of that relationship in some way? That seems pretty clear to me. They love Elbereth. I mean, she's their girl, right? Um,
Mhm.
and there's all this language of light connected with the elves, particularly that Galadriel's face shines. That sometimes when the elves are walking through the Shire, they see light kind of falling at their feet. But then, of course, the big finale would be Eärendil, you know, this human slash elf figure who becomes a star effectively, right?
Mhm.
Uh, what does that mean exactly? It's some kind of deification going on. And so, particularly as an Orthodox Christian, where deification, or what's called theosis in Greek, is such like a central part of our theology, I feel like there's maybe something that Orthodox Christians have to say about this that might not occur as much to other traditions. So yeah, there's so much more one could say. I just kind of set up the initial model for just the council itself, but then there's actually what happens next, which of course is a big part of what's going on in the Bible and Christian tradition.
Mhm. This unfortunately was a conversation we had to have quite early on, wasn't it? What
I know,
darlings are you going to be able to
I know,
kill?
I know.
Because you can't put it all into your thesis. That's always been the way for you when you've been a student in my class, though, a million ideas that you've then had to frustratingly squidge down into a short space, right?
Yeah.
Hmm. Okay, I'm going back to the Q&A. Isaac asks, could not Arda's vice-regent be seen as playing the role that Adam would have played had he not fallen? If so, it's quite Christian.
Um, yes. I will say shorthand yes, because of course Manwë is one of the Valar. He's
Hmm.
not, you know, he's not an elf or a human. Um, he's one of the Valar. But yes, I mean he's the king of the gods. He's the king of the world. And Adam is traditionally set up to be the king of the world. That is who he's supposed to be. He, this is the job that he was given, and he walks away from it by doing what he did in the garden. So yes, I think that there's would be some interesting exploration there. And in fact, again, I would add this to my list of things if I, had a thesis that was a lot longer.
Hmm. Okay. Excuse me. Question from Tom. Father Andrew, would you say that Tolkien's view of cosmology better aligns with a Catholic or Orthodox understanding of the seen and unseen world?
I think that his understanding of cosmology and of the seen and the unseen basically aligns with the medieval world. And so as a result, at that point, um, although with scholasticism, you're starting to get this kind of idea of nature and supernature.
Mm.
Um, but he doesn't seem to lean into that. I do need to read that Thomistic book about this and see what this guy says about it. But to me, it doesn't seem to lean into nature and supernature. I don't see those categories in Middle Earth. I see seen and unseen natures. And so what I would say is that what he has, his view in his model that he's depicted in his works, would be common to early medieval Catholicism and absolutely common to medieval and certainly current Orthodox Christianity, which still has the basic spiritual model as a three-level cosmology. You've got heaven, Middle Earth, and the underworld. It's interesting to me that Tolkien tries to merge that together in some way with the round Earth cosmology in response to the sins of Numenor by making the world be round. But that's not particularly a view associated with any religion. And the ancient Greeks knew the world was round, so they had no problem with the idea of having sort of a spiritual cosmology and a kind of more material cosmology at the same time.
Hmm. Okay, a question from Anders. Anders asks, a possible difference from both paganism and Christianity. It is only in the timeless halls that Eru is present in the Divine Council, while the Valar in Arda are normally left on their own and only exceptionally receive messages from Eru. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think that it is a difference, but I think that it is a difference that's more apparent than real. And here's why I'm going to say that. In almost every pagan tradition, you have the Most High God kind of recedes into the background, and it's this vice regent figure who is the one that's really on the scene. So this is not necessarily as apparent in the actual religion, in the mythological texts, but it's definitely apparent, for instance, in archaeological stuff. So like with Norse paganism, this is the most obvious example. Almost every single sacrificial site that's dug up somewhere in Scandinavia, it's clear that they're worshiping Thor, not Odin. Now, they wouldn't have said that Odin is not worshipful, but Thor's the guy who's showing up and making it rain and giving them victory. And so, like, of course, they're going to worship him. That's what they want. Christianity has something of the same model, right? There's the vice regent, the Son of God, who is super interactive. He's present on earth and talking to people. And actually, traditionally, it's understood that when this divine figure, the word of the Lord or the angel of the Lord, shows up in the Old Testament, that is the Son of God, that the Father is still kind of in the background, right? And so that's why, for instance, traditional iconography of the creation of Adam, it's literally Jesus creating Adam in Eden, right? So it's, yes, a lot of people have said this, oh, Eru's not really involved, whatever. But if you take into account Manwë as this figure that's kind of Michael, kind of Christ, kind of Adam, then he's definitely on the scene. And in Lord of the Rings, of course, almost all of them are off camera, but there are these references. And so in that way, Lord of the Rings is in some ways kind of the most modern element of the legendarium, kind of the most disenchanted, so to speak. Now, it's but very enchanted compared to our day-to-day life, but there's not a lot of interaction with the unseen world going on there.
Okay, question from Joseph. Would Sauron rising to power after Morgoth resemble the succession of a lesser power, not over the Most High, but over the original usurper? Also, what would Sauron, the Balrogs, and the Nazgul correspond to in Christian tradition? For example, could the Nazgul correlate to the Nephilim in some way?
Yes, absolutely. So again, these are all these things that I would love to have written about. Um,
Mhm,
yeah, so it's interesting. Tolkien does the succession myth twice on some level, but Sauron doesn't have to defeat anybody to gain the place that he gets. But again, it's temporary. He doesn't really rule. He doesn't even rule Arda, to say nothing about Ea, the world that is. Um, so it's Tolkien, it seems to me, loves to take these stories and remix them and then remix them again and then remix them again. How if it turned out this way? How if it turned out this way? What if the
mhm,
bad guys are good guys? What if the good guys are bad guys? What if the monster is actually good? He does this over and over again. So Balrogs, these other kind of demonic figures, dragons, um, these are all really, the way he depicts them is straight up demonology. I mean, he's just digging up stuff that most of us aren't thinking about, but is all there. The Nazgul are essentially, yes, they're essentially like Nephilim. So these are demonized humans. They're humans that function like fallen angels. Essentially, they are the opposite in Christianity. They are the opposite of saints. That's what giants are. That's what Nephilim are. Is they're the opposite of saints. So yes, while you see, children of Ilúvatar can be kind of deified, you can also see them go the other way as well.
mhm, mhm. Okay, I'm taking one last question from the chat, from the Q&A box, and it's from Serena. Serena says, well, she asks, how literally did Tolkien believe in these gods and in fairies, neutrals, all kinds of other supernatural beings? And do you believe in them too?
I definitely do believe in them. So how literally would Tolkien have believed in them? Um, so it's an interesting question. So
Hmm.
as a good Roman Catholic, absolutely he believes in angels and demons. This is standard Orthodox Roman Catholicism. So if someone just wants to map it onto that, angels and demons, that's pretty easy to do. But I think there's some more interesting places to look. So in his talks about the Kalevala, which are published in the volume that's the story of Kullervo that Dr. Verlin Flieger put together, which everybody should have a copy of that if you don't. In those talks, there's one point where he says, and this is actually the epigram for my thesis. And I'm probably going to paraphrase. I'm going to get it wrong, so I'm paraphrasing a little bit. But he basically says that unless you have something approximating to a belief in the old gods, then you can't really understand these stories that include them. Not just a kind of, um, you know, uh, uh, suspension of disbelief, that you have to believe in them on some level to really get the stories. So he doesn't come out and say, I believe in gods. I believe in, he doesn't say that, but he does say that unless you do, you're not really going to get this, which is very suggestive to me, which suggests to me that he does. Now, a Christian interpretation of that is actually very straightforward, which is, yes, the beings that pagans worship are real. They are real beings. They just shouldn't be being worshipped from a Christian point of view. They are either fallen angels or in some cases demonized humans. Where it gets a little sketchy is where you have stories about fairies and so forth. It's like, well, whose side are they on? Are they good? They bad? They neutral? And it was kind of a funny thing to me to discover in some of my research that there is a medieval trope of fairies approaching priests and asking them, am I going to be saved at the end of the world? Can I be saved? Can I have salvation, like humans? And the priest always basically tells them that's not a thing, and which is kind of funny to me. But and someone I had a conversation with someone where they raised this question of these neutral spirits, and I said, look, Christianity doesn't you're either obeying God or you're disobeying him. There's not a neutrality. And a friend of mine, actually a fellow Signum grad, Richard Rowland, he said in this exchange, he said, look, Father Andrew is just saying the thing that priests always say in medieval texts when a fairy asks them this question. So yes, I think that Tolkien does have a sense of the unseen world and exactly what that model looks like, how its taxonomy would have gone. I think that as a good Catholic, he would certainly have said they're spirits, they're either, obedient or disobedient. But as a storyteller, he's willing to kind of set some of those specific categories aside in order to tell the story that he wants to tell.
Hmm. So is it another case of go not to a priest for a straight answer, for he shall say both yes and no?
Yes, I think that is often the case.
That seems fair. Okay, and so we need to bring this thesis theatre to a close, which, to be honest with you, I think we could all be here for another hour. There are still 12 questions in the Q&A box, and there's still so much I know that you could tell us about your thesis. And just to let people know, the thesis will be in the Signum library. So if you are a member of the Signum body, a student, a member of faculty, a member of staff, you will have access to it. It will not be open access for 2 years. So anybody else who wants to read it, I'm afraid you'll have to contact Father Andrew and ask him for a copy, because we do actually give the students control over their intellectual property. So I will just let you know that. Although I believe you may possibly have some plans for a wee bit of publishing when it comes
Yeah,
to.
I've all these other ideas. I mean, I think it would make a nice, coherent book. Maybe 40, 50,000 words or something like that. So, and I have a publisher already that I've talked to about it, and they've said, yeah, maybe we'd like to do that. So we'll see.
That sounds like a plan. Well, please, everybody, join me in congratulating Father Andrew, who has, of course, passed his master's degree. And I'm not going to surprise anyone when I say passed his master's degree with honours. Absolutely fantastic work. It has been a delight to work with you. Thank you so much for allowing me to work with you on this. That's a tremendous thesis that you have put forward, Father Andrew.
Thank you.
So
And likewise, I mean, and thank you. And I'll have to say, for current or future Signum students, everyone take the class Tolkien and Tradition with Dr. Brown, because that's the class where, I mean, it was the first class I took in Signum 4 years ago now. And that was the one where I said, wait a minute, Tolkien and paganism and Christianity, this is a big paper. So
uh,
there it is.
light bulbs went off. Yes, that's
Exactly.
one of Berlin Flieger's wonderful courses that we do, Tolkien and Tradition. And it is a fabulous course. Okay, thank you everybody for joining us today. It's been lovely to see so many of you come to see Father Andrew deliver his talk on his thesis. I hope that those of you who are able to do grab a copy out of the library to have a read of it. Those of you who cannot wait for a publication, you'll need to get in touch with Father Andrew yourself. And if anybody's thinking, you know what, I want to watch this thesis theatre over again, at some point very soon, this thesis theatre will be in the Signum YouTube channel. So do go and look out for that. Thank you so much, everybody. I will bring this thesis theatre to a close, and I hope to see you at other thesis theatres in the future. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.